Hello, York University alumni and friends. Welcome to Scholars Hub at Home. My name is Ali Gampel, and I am the Associate Director of Alumni Programs. We are so glad that you have chosen to be with us today for our exciting and timely lecture that's titled The Three Key Puzzles of Political Trust with Carrie Wu. Dr. Wu is an assistant professor in the Department of Sociology in York's Faculty of Liberal Arts and Professional Studies and is York's research chair in political sociology of health. Before we begin, I'd like to just note this week on September 30th, we mark the National Day for Truth and Reconciliation, a day that was created 2 years ago in 2021, following the identification of unmarked burials at former residential school sites. As I'm about to acknowledge the land that I'm on, I'm filled with so much sadness. And as I think about the tragic and painful legacy of residential schools and how it continues to impact the lives of Indigenous peoples across the country. It will be a long journey towards meaningful reconciliation, but I'd like to now accept my responsibility to acknowledge the land that I'm on, and I invite you to acknowledge the traditional territory that you're on. The website nativeland.ca is a good resource for learning, and it should appear in the chat. I am a member of the York University community. Many Indigenous nations have long-standing relationships with the territories upon which York campuses are located that precede the establishment of the university. York acknowledges its presence on the traditional territory of many Indigenous nations. The area known as Tekaronto has been caretaken by the Anishinaabe Nation, the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, and the Huron-Wendat. It is now home to many First Nation, Inuit, and Métis communities. We acknowledge the current treaty holders, the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This territory is subject of the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Belt Covenant, an agreement to peaceably share and care for the Great Lakes region. I'm proud of the work that we're doing at York towards truth and reconciliation, and honored that I get to work with our Indigenous alumni network to create positive change. York is also deeply committed to sustainability, and I am excited, on a positive note, to tell you that York University has been recognized among the world's top 40 universities in the 2023 Times Higher Education Impact Rankings for our commitment towards advancing the very important United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. And now let's get on with today's topic. Just before we begin, we like to conduct a quick poll. And so a question is about to appear. And if you could just take a moment to answer, the question is, how would you rate your knowledge regarding the topic of today's presentation? I'll give you a moment to respond. We're going to be talking about the three key puzzles of political trust. Wonderful. It's very helpful to know your level of knowledge as we come into this conversation. Just for a bit of housekeeping, most of us are pros by now, but if you need any help at all with a Zoom webinar, please feel free to click on the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen and enter your question. We've got a team who's ready to help you. And that same button can be used to submit your questions for our guest speaker to answer during the Q&A period that will precede his presentation. I do note that all of your questions and comments are visible to our team, so please keep your comments relevant and respectful. At this point, it gives me great pleasure to introduce Carrie Wu. Carrie is an assistant professor and York Research Chair in Political Sociology of Health at York University. His research focuses on exploring the significance of trust in shaping social outcomes. So, Dr. Wu, I invite you to turn your camera on. We are so pleased that you are here with us today, and we welcome you to this talk. Carrie, are you able to turn on your screen? There you are. Welcome. It's good to have you here.
Thank you, Alison. Thank you. Thank you, everyone, for coming today. So I'm going to share my screen. So for today, what I'm going to talk about is part of my research on why do people trust in the government or distrust in the government and how that matters. And then especially I will focus on three key puzzles. One is, why do people in China have very high trust in their government? And then it has been stable over time. Second puzzle is, why in many Western democracies, political trust or people have become less and less trust in the government. And the third puzzle is really thinking about racial differences in trust. Why in the US and sometimes in Canada that racialized Black Canadians or Black Americans sometimes have higher trust in the government. So for the first puzzle, I'm going to show you with this 1993, almost 3 decades ago. That's probably the first survey being conducted by a political scientist from Duke University. From the survey, you can see almost 70% of Chinese 30 years ago, they say they can generally trust decisions made by their government, central government. And then from the World Value Survey, is a survey program that been collecting data across many countries over the world using the same question: do you have confidence in the government? From the survey, you can see from 2001, 2007, 13, 2018, you see people in China have expressed very, very high trust in the government. And that you can see over time, the trust, high trust is relatively stable. During the pandemic, I also did an online survey. We surveyed almost 25,000 of Chinese during the early stage of the pandemic. And then the key findings also suggest that people in China, even the pandemic, did not shake people's trust in the government, right? So I wrote a small piece for the Washington Post, and it's being shared by many media outlets and even in China and outside China. But why do people in China has been very, very politically trusting, right? So a lot of comments I check from the online engagement is that is Chinese trust in government real, right? Many of you may ask, do really people in China trust their government? It's probably maybe is out of the political fear. They're not really expressing genuine views toward the government, right? So that could, a lot of people have that kind of doubt and concern. And then from research points, I'm also arguing maybe the survey is no good, right? Survey sometimes is just no good for data collection, right? But for example, a lot of different ways of researching about public opinion, for example, qualitative interviews, and no matter how the questions are being phrased, the general conclusion is that people in China do trust the government. And then from social science research point of view, there are three kind of approaches. One is, China is just an outlier. The high political trust is an outlier. And in analysis, many political scientists, sociologists, they just exclude high trust in China as in their analysis as an outlier, right? So that's one way of dealing with high trust in China. The second way is that it's too good to be true, right? And then social scientists trying to figure out the bias in data collection, right? And the third way is really because over time, so many national, international, quantitative survey and qualitative survey, they reach the same conclusion that people do trust the government. So a lot of scholars really take this patterns very seriously and then try to really find ways to understand why do people in China trust and what's the meaning of political trust in China. That's the third way. And the second puzzle is relatively compared to China, high and stable. In many Western democracies, political trust has been declining. For example, in the United States, the American National Election Study, they have been conducting surveys since 1958, right? So it's more than almost close to 100 years, 80 years. And then they show that trust has been declining. From the World Value Survey, for example, the Pew Research Center, for example, you see the huge decline over time from 1960 to more last year, 2022, right? You see a huge decline of trust. And then from the World Value Survey, relatively, just for comparison with the Chinese data, you can also see people in the United States over time have become less trust in their government, right? So the key puzzle here is that governments over time, right? So many decades, sometimes government can be good, other times they perform not so good, right? So but the decline trust has never been recovered. People just over time become less and less trust. It seems has nothing to do with government performance. So that's why this can be a puzzle too. And then in the literature, there's also kind of three approaches. One is panic approach, right? So declining trust in the government, in political institution, that means crisis of democracy, because democracy require people's support, political support from the public, right? So if there's declining trust, then the potential is crisis of democracy. So that's one kind of interpretation. A second interpretation is that China has high trust. Western democracies have low and declining trust. So they try to, some of scholars try to figure out what's the meaning of the kind of the declining trust, right? So this, I call it feeling good approach. The approach, think about, okay, people in Western democracies, they don't trust the government because that reflects their evaluation of the performance, but they still have high satisfaction with democracy or how democracy works, right? So they understand the declining trust as a way of kind of feeling good approach, thinking about democracy is not in crisis, right? But declining trust is just a good evaluation or reflection of government performance. But like I mentioned, right, over time, government sometimes can be bad, other times can be good, but the declining trust has never been recovered. A third approach is really a typology kind of approach, really separate different types of trust, right? So try to understand, oh, some people express political trust in different ways from other people, right? So one is diffuse, more like toward political regime as a whole, political community or democratic institutions. Another is more specific, is evaluation of what the government did or did not do, right? To meet a citizen expectation, and that like try to separate different type of trust. And then there's media talking about, right? So for example, here is just one example about the panic kind of approach from the public, from the media, thinking about lower and declining trust in the US. A third puzzle is really, so over time, I mentioned that ANES data, right? They have been collecting data since 1958. And over time, you see in terms of race and political trust, you do not see racial minorities have lower trust. And many times or many years, you see they, in general, have significantly higher trust in government, in political institutions, right? So it's very difficult. So for example, here's ANES data. I analyzed all those data since 1958, and then you see the different racial minority groups. And then the reference line is white Americans. And then you see the racial minorities trust is up and down, up and down, up and down, right? And a lot of time you see they're in the positive direction, meaning racial minorities tend to have more trust in the government than white Americans, right? And a lot of theories about race and the political trust do not explain what's going on, right? So for example, one theory is more like institutional, right? So arguing about political representation, for example, in the government, in political leadership, when there are underrepresentation of racial minorities, or there's ongoing discrimination, institutional discrimination, and that institutional kind of like performance will damage people's, especially racial minority trust. But this theory does not hold because the empirical pattern, right? Because sometimes they have more trust. A second theory is, for example, a cultural experience, arguing that political trust a lot to do with people, how people engage in politics. For example, go out and vote, political participation, and then even in general, political interest or discussion, politics with families and friends. And then in research in general, racial minorities and immigrants, for example, they tend to be kind of less likely to go out and vote, less likely to engage in politics, and therefore they should have lower trust based on the kind of like those socialization theory, right? But the empirical pattern also do not seem to support those kind of theories. So this could be a puzzle too. So why, right? So the key kind of solution I've been thinking is really is the meaning, is the changing very meanings of trust. When people think about government, not people understand or evaluate the government different in the same way, right? For racial groups, but also across countries, but also over time, right? And then some recent literature suggests that people trust the government. It has nothing to do with the government. It's more about the social change, about people themselves, right? It's especially in China, we saw, for example, people have very high trust in government, right? But a lot of time they have little contact with government, right? And there's little engagement with the government. So maybe it's not about the government, it's about people and the social change and the meaning of trust. So the empirical challenge is really how to decode the meaning of trust, especially from survey data, right? How do we kind of decode the meaning of trust? My argument is that we need kind of a shift in focus on how much people trust, right? It's like the level of trust, like how much do you trust, the level, do you have more and less kind of trust? We shift the focus from this how much to how people trust, right? How people trust means the patterns of trust instead of the level of trust. So that's kind of like a approach, really thinking about a way to decoding the meaning of a political trust. So to understand high and stable trust in China, for example, I look at how Chinese people, they trust different levels of government in different ways, right? So the pattern is very clear. In China, people have much higher trust in the higher level of government than local and community level, which is opposite to, for example, people here in Canada, in the United States, and almost every countries in the world, people have more trust in the community, local level government, except China. Chinese people have much higher trust in the higher level government than the local level government. And the one way to explain this pattern, the meaning of trust is really a lot to do with political socialization, media socialization. So over time, there are a lot of media in China that always praise good policy from top down. That's good policy. But when things go wrong, they blame the local implementation, local government implementation is no good, right? So that over time, that kind of media socialization, political censorship of image building is one reason that why Chinese people have high trust in the government, especially in the higher level trust in the higher level government, right? So this pattern helped really kind of decode the meaning. For the declining trust in the Western democracies, one way I look at is that how people in Canada, in United States, think about different political institutions, for example, right? So in the survey, when Canadians, Americans ask about whether they trust in specific political institutions, some Americans, some Canadians, they will say, I trust all the way, right? I trust the police, I trust the medical institution, I trust the local government, I trust the federal government, right? Some Canadians, they will say, I trust some institutions more than other institutions. And then there's some other Canadians that they just distrust all the way, right? So this kind of patterns about the variations in how people express trust in different political institutions will really help we understand kind of like how people think about the government and different political institutions, right? So some people have trust all the way, distrust all the way, or trust some institutions more than others. And I categorize those people who trust some institutions more than other institutions as more like critical truster, right? When they answer the survey, they really think about, oh, the police maybe did better job than some other political institution, or the federal is better than the provincial, right? So they have this reasoning, they have this specific evaluation, and that is more critical, right? So cross-nationally, we will see in China, for example, almost 40% Chinese, they have diffuse trust. They will trust no matter what kind of political institution all the way, right? But in Australia, New Zealand, Canada, United States, vast majority of people, they have more critical trust, that trust some institutions more than others, right? So in general, this kind of pattern shows that meaning of trust among different citizens in different countries could be different, right? So relatively, if we just focus on how much people trust, the level of trust is very difficult to compare, because the meaning underlying the level of trust can be different cross-nationally. And finally, I want to highlight, how do we understand racial minorities higher trust, sometimes higher trust in political institutions? I want to focus three kind of patterns, dimensions. One is I want to compare between groups gaps, right? So between groups, meaning that differences in trust between different racial and ethnic groups, right? So this is also a common approach. People, when they research about race and political trust, they compare, okay, trust among Blacks, among Asians, among Latinos, right? Different racial minorities. So that's between group. And second is within group variation. Thinking about among Blacks, do they trust the police more than the federal government or the local government or provincial government? How people from each specific racial group trust different political institutions differently within group. And finally is within institutional variation. How police, for example, be trusted equally by different racial minority groups. So here are some patterns. For example, for trust in the government, racial minorities tend to always have higher trust in federal government than white Canadians. For example, this is Canadian data. So white racial visible minority groups in Canada, they always have higher trust in relative to white Americans. But in relative to police, white Canadians have much, much higher trust in the police than racial minority, right? So this one kind of like one pattern. Another pattern is really within each racial minority groups, you see different variation, right? So for example, for white, you see more variation in their trust in different political institutions, right? So you can see white have more trust in police, but less trust in federal government. And that variation is greater than Black Americans. They have lower variation in terms of their trust in the police and their trust in the federal government, for example. And this variation also help us understand more about the differences among racial minorities' political trust. And finally, it's the within institutions, right? So for example, how the police is being trusted differently by different racial minority groups. The key finding is that, for example, we often talk about trust in police, and the police violence in recent years have damaged Black Canadians and the Black Americans' trust. But the data shows that Black Canadian, Black Americans, they do not have lower trust in police than in federal government, but they do have lower trust in police than white Americans trust in police, right? So in general, the conclusion about Blacks have lower trust in police could be wrong, right? It's just we compare to white, Blacks have lower trust in police. But when we think about Blacks, their trust in the federal government and in the police, Blacks tend to have higher trust in the police than in the federal government, right? But if we do not compare those patterns, all those conclusions from the media, from the research, because we compare Blacks' trust in police to the white Americans, white Canadians, and the white Canadians have very high trust in the police, right? So the conclusion is Blacks tend to have lower trust and mistrust in police, but in reality is they have higher trust in police than in federal government. So in general, that's the three kind of puzzles I want to share, and also the three kind of like ways of looking at the patterns and how that patterns really help focusing on how people trust instead of how much people trust, really help us understand different meanings of trust, why people trust in China have high and stable trust in their government, and why the decline of political trust in Western democracy despite good bad governmental performance, and why sometimes racial minority have higher trust in the government and in different political institutions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. My head is buzzing with all of the information and data that you presented. Thank you very much for this research and for sharing it with our community. Okay, so we are on to our Q&A, and I think I could probably fill about 3 hours with my own questions, but I do want to leave time for our audience to ask their questions. So for our audience, should you have any questions, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen and type in your question, and then I'll ask it to Professor Wu on your behalf. For any audience members who are joining us from Facebook, you're welcome to submit any questions or comments in the comment section for the video. Okay, so I'll read those questions as they come in. But I guess the question that we should start with is, why does this matter? Why do we care about political trust? What are the impacts here?
Thank you for this question. Yes, I spent a lot of time researching about people's political trust and also social trust, right? So social trust and political trust is part of the, like a lot of research suggests, part of the, for example, social capital, right? And then when people have good relationship with the government, with other people, that matters for a wide range of social outcomes, right? So a lot of research suggests when people politically more trusting, they have better mental health, they're happier, and then they have higher social capital, then that turns into, for example, higher educational achievement, higher income, right? And during the pandemic also, right, political trust is one of the best predictor for all those pandemic behaviors, right? Why people wear masks, why people engage in social distancing, why people go get vaccinated, right? So political and social trust both matters for those pandemic behavior, and that good for society as a whole, right? So that's, and then because like I showed, there's a lot of inequality in political trust. Some people trusting, other people they don't. And that inequality also create more inequality, because more inequality in health, more inequality in socioeconomic status, and that social and political trust can be key to really understand all the inequality and the growing inequality, for example, in Canadian society.
Absolutely. I think this lends us really well to the questions from the audience that are pouring in. So we have a question from Danielle who comments, and I agree that your research is very interesting. And talking about COVID, Danielle asks, I wonder how much Chinese trust in government and at which level was impacted by COVID-19 and the government's management of it. Do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so so that's a specific question I did look into in early stage of the pandemic. So we collect data in April, like 2020, is just like right after the major wave of pandemic in China, after March 2020. And then we surveyed 25 kind of like Chinese citizens online. I collaborate with more than like 20 some professors and also 300 students, we were able to collect that data. And the data shows that people, especially during the first wave, after the first wave, they have very high trust. Their trust in government has been stable, did not change, right? But over time, there are more surveys coming out, and then in general, there's not much change in people's trust in the government.
Okay, interesting. The next question that came in from Judith is asking actually about censorship. And Judith asks, what role does government censorship, whether voluntary or planned, play in the shown levels of trust?
So this is a very good question, right? So my research kind of like suggests it's not like immediate censorship. It's not like, okay, this year political do something to censor people's opinions and that generate high political trust in China. But more specifically, it really is about political socialization over time, right? From textbook, from media, from state-owned media. They talk about like the country, they talk about the political leaders, and they always have like positive image, and they censor negative image about the government, about political leaders. And that over time really helps socialize young Chinese, for example, from school, from educational system, and that generate high and stable trust. It's not, okay, this year, government did what, and that generate high trust. The political trust is not learned in that way. Political trust is more learned over the life, especially early on, like through education, through families, through parenting. And then because Chinese government, they have, for example, in textbook, in the state-owned media, they often have overall positive images or like portrayed of the leaders and the government, and that generate high trust generation after generation, right? So that's how I believe that how political socialization, media censorship works in terms of creating high political support.
That makes a lot of sense. And I think you've done some early research when I was Googling you about the role that parents play in shaping the levels of trust in their children. So, and I think you said that that was actually sort of a key component. So I'm actually curious, and I'm not sure if your research covered it, but if Chinese families immigrate to Western countries, does that trust follow them? Do they then trust, the Canadian government, let's say, if they move from China to Canada?
Very good question. This is the question I'm going to answer next week. So I'm going to Calgary to attend a research symposium. The title I'm going to talk is how trustful are Chinese Canadians, right? And then I look at both social trust and political trust, and then I separate birthplace. Chinese Canadians born locally here in Canada, born from mainland China, born from Hong Kong, from Taiwan, and how these different groups, depending on the birthplace and how they trust socially and politically. The pattern is that Chinese coming out from mainland China, they have higher social trust and higher political trust, and then higher than Canadian. So Canadian born is ranked second in terms of social trust. Canadians, we generally have high social trust. Relatively, we also have higher political trust compared to people in the United States, right? So Chinese Canadian who were born here, they also have higher trust than Chinese Canadian coming from who were born in Hong Kong and in Taiwan, right? So you see that, so that suggests that really this cultural influences and then parenting, family, and even migration, immigration in different political environments sometimes do not seem to affect people's trust, because this type of trust could be learned early on and then can be rigid, like it can be more stable.
I get that. Is there any difference in the level of trust, especially in a democracy, when election results are really close, or if there's a sort of a clear winner in terms of elections?
Yeah, so that's political scientists. They are very interested in this kind of question. They study a lot of election voting and how that So they documented the winner's effect, right? So after in Canada, for example, after the election, oftentimes when the Liberal government won, and of course, people who identified in terms of political ideology as liberal, they have higher trust in the government. But then when they lost, there's a decline of like this kind of impact, immediate impact in terms of voting, that in terms of psychology, right? But this type of impact often is temporal, like short term, right? And over time, life course, they will regress back to their general level at individual, general level of trust, right? But there's even the disaster crisis, for example, in the United States, the 9/11 terror attack, that attack has led to higher trust among Americans in political institutions and in other people, right? Because when there's disaster, when crisis happens, especially terror attack, people feeling there's a sense of togetherness, sense of solidarity, right? So they have this term really demonstrate that there's the effect of the crisis on leading to higher trust among people, social and political. But this type of effect is often short-term, temporal, and it often comes back to the mean level.
Right. And so I guess our perception of those events is largely shaped by media. So I want to ask, so the audience is flooding us with questions. Susie says, perhaps the considerable difference in global media's coverage of a country's decisions and actions, even if coverage is critical versus coverage of lower level local decisions and actions, influences citizens' belief in their country's standing in the world, leading to patriotic pride and political trust. Any thoughts on that?
Exactly, right? So the media socialization, and not just 1 day, 2 days, over time, right? Often people exposed to those positive or negative ways of describing one country or leader, and that oftentimes lead to lower and higher trust among people. For example, when we think about people, international trust, there's also research about international trust. For example, how Canadians, Americans see China, and how Chinese people see Americans and Canadians. And then this international trust, do they trust, we also have survey asking, do Canadians trust, for example, the political leaders in China? And one pattern we often see is that people in Quebec, they have higher trust in political leaders in China than people from the rest of the country, right? One explanation is the media, right? So people in Quebec, they are less likely to follow US English media, which oftentimes have more negative views of China or describing or story about China. So that media has important impact, shaping how, for example, Canadians from different regions and places see Chinese and see Americans, right? So in general, I didn't look into the data, but I would expect that people in Quebec, they have less favorable views toward Americans than people from Canada or in Ontario, for example. Ontario, we may have more favorable views of American relative to China or Chinese than people from Quebec. So, and a lot to do with the medium and how people exposed to that media coverage, and how all those media talk about different countries, different cultural.
Right. I'm originally from Quebec, but Anglophone Quebec. So I'm actually, really pondering what that looks like. I'll have to poll my family next time I visit. I think that leads nicely to a question that Jeremy's asking about attitude. And Jeremy thanks you, as we all do, but also says, I think that attitude certainty often increases the impact of attitude. Do you know if there are any data not only on trust, but on the certainty in the trust and any international difference?
I didn't quite get the question, like how attitudes reinforce attitudes. Is that?
I think so. And I think what Jeremy is asking is about the certainty of trust. So we trust, but then how certain are we in our trust, right?
Yeah, very, very
interesting question.
Very, very interesting, right? So this different dimension of trust, right? So there's a level of trust, but how sure that your trust is in this. Yeah, but that second dimension, I haven't done any research and didn't really find a way to really think about how to at the population level we can do, right? So that's the variation. So for example, in Canada, we have trust in federal government, but you see a long variation. Some people very high trust, some people very low trust. But in some other countries, you'll be more certain in terms of trust in government. There's majority of people at the center, right? They all have high trust, and that could demonstrate that, for example, in certain places they're more certain in terms of lower variation. But at individual level, probably it will be difficult to do in terms of like for each specific institutions. But for more institutions that we can do that, and just look at the variation across political institutions. For some people, for example, they have similar high trust toward all types of political institutions, and that could suggest more certain, more sure about their trust. But for other individuals, they have some high trust in some political institutions, but they have very low trust in other political institutions. And that variation could suggest more uncertain. So that could be a way, but I haven't really like think or frame those kind of patterns in certainty of trust. But it's a great idea, really is a great idea.
Jeremy writes, thank you. So I think you answered that question really well. I am going to turn, actually, Danielle asks if you've considered adding a question. So Danielle asks, have you considered adding a question to inform how much an individual perceives their life's outcome to be due to the government and how much due to individual initiative? Is that a factor in trust?
Very, very good question, right? So that's a lot of kind of more recent. That's also I'm trying to get into the how citizen expectation shape people's trust. Right? One way to understand people's high trust in China is that people have very low expectation from the government, like historically and then like in life course, right? So when they're struggling with their life, facing high inequality, housing issues, social problems, like oftentimes they don't connect all those issues, individual issues, to the government, right? So like sometimes or the media or there's some certain kind of education make them internalize all those social problems. They'll say, I didn't work harder, or I didn't do enough personally, and that's to do with government. But in Western democracy, I would expect that people here, us, we kind of like, we are more like this, probably political freedom, and also there's media education, and that make us to think about a lot has to do with the government, political decisions, policies, right? Like for example, the crime, the rise of homeless population, the housing crisis, and a lot to do with policy decisions. And we know that, and the media talk about that, and that we have this more political awareness of government failures or success, and that we will connect more all those individual personal issues to the government, to the public, and that lead to over lower trust or critical trust. But in China, they just less likely to connect, and the media are less likely to talk about those things, and that good citizen expectation. When they have lower expectation, no matter what governments do or didn't do, has less impact on their trust or opinions in general. Great question.
Yeah, it really was. And I think you put up a slide about midway through your presentation, and I think it was about in Western countries where you showed sort of a steep decline in levels of trust that took place around like in the 1970s. If I have that right, what was that all about? Did something happen that like there was this really sharp decline that I just noticed and noted down?
That's a great question. The political scientist from Harvard, Putnam, he explained through violence. He argued that during 1960s, 1970s in the US, there's a huge increase in all types of crime and violence, and that social unrest has damaged people's trust socially and also institutionally, and that trust has never been recovered from that point. So that's during 1960s and 70s, a lot of crime and violence during that time, I didn't really look into, but I understand that this like you picked up, and then people also talk about that. And then another argument is about inequality. Over time, the rise of social inequality has led to lower trust.
Thank you for answering that. So we're nearing the end of our time together. We're going to ask two more questions. So I have one coming in from the audience, and then I'm going to sort of wrap us up. So the final question that I'm going to ask from the audience comes from Judith, who asks about media. So Judith says, regarding access to varied media, both in China, where it seems to be restricted, and in Canada, how would media access influence overall levels of trust in government?
Yeah, so media access, and the access to what kind of media, right? So a lot of like communication scholars, they have spent a lot of time research. It's a big topic in communication, how media and media exposure shape people's public opinion, not just trust, right? But in China, in general, different types of media. The traditional media, there's also like more new media, internet, and all those. In general, the finding is that people follow traditional media, for example, TV, radio, or newspaper. They have higher trust in the government relative to people who spend a lot of time online, internet, and that, right? So that's the pattern. So the access to media, and then what kind of media, of course, have differential impact on people's views, political views. Here too, right? We mentioned in Canada too, people from different social backgrounds. Sometimes people follow New York Times, Washington Post. Others they follow some other, for example, other type of political coverage, and that create differential impact about how people think about government, see government, and trust or not trusting the government.
Thank you. So as we wrap up, let's turn to our community. And, our communities have certainly been affected by the pandemic and by sort of isolation and whatnot. So just want to conclude by asking, how is trust in government related to people's trust in one another? And does that vary geographically?
Yeah, so this is also a question that is heavily researched in political science. It's debated too, right? Some scholars argue people trust in each other has nothing to do with people trust in government, right? So people trust in each other is more people see goodness of other people, and people trust in the government is more evaluation of the government performance and all that. That has nothing to do. So, and a lot of evidence, cross-national evidence suggests there's not much correlation. But there also a lot of evidence suggests that when people have trust in political institutions, trusting the state, trusting the people, as this paper with that kind of title, using more like panel data. Like from my perspective, I do research into those relationships. Is really when people have trust in political institutions, they feel more certain, they are happier, they are healthier, and then they oftentimes more engaging, and all those lead to their higher trust in other people, right? So political trust does have impact on people's trust in each other. When there's very little political trust, it also means politically unstable in the society, and then people have no confidence in the government. Then that lead to people's unrest, or like the anxiety, stress, and all those contribute to their lower trust, less likely to trust in other people as well.
Right. Okay. So it sounds like if we're on the fence in our trust, we might want to veer to the side of more trust, just for our own health and well-being. We could probably talk about this topic for hours and hours, and certainly your research spans so much of this. Dr. Wu, thank you so much for being with us today and sharing this. We have comments coming in thanking you and thanking the Scholars Hub team. So on behalf of all of us here, a real thank you to you for this interesting and engaging dialogue. We really appreciate it.
Thank you for having me. Thank you everyone for joining today.
Yeah. Our pleasure. Yes. So Carrie, if you want, you can turn off your camera, and I'm just going to conclude with some closing remarks. Thank you to all of our participants, our alumni and friends and guests who've chosen to be with us and learn together with the York community today. I'd like to also thank some of our behind the scenes colleagues who work on making this happen, Jenny Evans, Yasmin, and all the wonderful events personnel that make this happen. It takes a team. So as many of you know, since you join us every second week when we do the Scholars Hub, these sessions do get recorded and they're available on our YouTube page. So feel free in a couple days when it pops up to visit youtube.com/YorkU alumni. Feel free to catch up on any past lectures that you may have missed. 2 weeks ago, we talked about this idea of charging $0 rent. It was fascinating. So if you missed that, definitely check it out. And feel free to share this one with your friends. We have one more poll question for you, and it's about to pop up. The question is, how would you rate your knowledge of today's topic following the discussion we've just had? So if you could take a moment to answer that, we are very grateful. Thank you. Okay, so in 2 weeks from now, on Wednesday, October 11th at noon, join us for our next Scholars Hub. It is titled The Role of Single-Use Plastics in Promoting a Sustainable Circular Economy, with Calvin Lacan, who's a research scientist in our Faculty of Environment and Urban Change. Register for that event and learn more about upcoming sessions at yorku.ca/alumni and friends. That's probably appearing for you in the comment section. Again, thank you all, wishing you a wonderful rest of your day, and see you at the next Scholars Hub. Bye.